Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Saturday Matters. If you've lived here for a few years, you know that Lowell will not disappoint us. He'll give us something really interesting and well prepared. Lowell, we're all eager to hear from you. Why do I always keep forgetting that?
So good morning. How am I for the mic? Okay. So a couple of weeks ago, I talked about art that was in European museums that people in their countries of origin wanted back. Today, I'm going to talk about items that are in fact in their country of origin, and the people here want them back. And that's the question about the repatriation of items from America's indigenous peoples. This is a typical museum display. I think, yeah, I'll make sure everything's on the right screen. Of Native American items in a typical American museum. So these are the kinds of things that you often see. What you don't usually see is what's behind the scenes, except the Burke is very interesting. They have opened up visual access to their storage areas. But these are just a couple of examples of museum storage areas that are found in your typical American museum. One way of displaying items in museums are in the form of what are called dioramas. This is one of my favorite ones. This is in the Milwaukee Public Museum. This was done by an artist a number of years ago, and it combines actual specimens with visual representations. This is called a diorama. And you can see here in the front a real buffalo, real horses, and then in the back, pictorial representations. This is a typical way of displaying items in museums, and oftentimes there's an attempt to reconstruct some kind of a cultural context. That is perhaps a dwelling with people around the fire inside and various cultural items around. So this is one way of presenting things in the appropriate context, and in this case, Plains Indians in the Milwaukee Public Museum. So what triggered this? Well, I used a similar slide to introduce the talk the other week about the Benin bronzes and the Elgin marbles. And this is from a New York Times article, Leading Museums Remove Native Displays Amid New Federal Rules. The American Museum of Natural History is closing 2 major halls as museums around the nation respond to updated policies from the Biden administration. The law went into effect, and I'll talk about it in 1990, but what's come out is recent interpretation of the implementation of that law. So that's what's triggered the activity that we see now. As I say, the law that we're going to talk about came out in 1990. There's 2 terms I want to contrast. The last time I talked about reparations and repatriation, and this time I'm talking about recreation versus repatriation. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Reparation refers to the action of repairing or making up for harm that has been done, actions of making amends or giving satisfaction for wrongs or injuries. Repatriation refers to returning persons or items to their place of origin. And both of these terms are of importance in discussing what's happening in American society. Reparation can be defined as payment of time, effort, or money made to undo past transgressions. It involves compensating for wrongs or injuries that were caused in the past. And an example is if someone has suffered harm due to historical injustices such as slavery, colonization, or war, Repatriation might involve financial compensation, land restitution, or other forms of redress. And the context, repatriations, or reparations, sorry, are often discussed in the context of addressing systematic inequalities, historical injustices, and human rights violations. This has most commonly been discussed with regard to reparation to the descendants of slaves for the injustices that were important in American history. Repatriation is defined as the process of returning a person or item to their country of origin or citizenship. It involves bringing something or someone back to its original homeland. When artifacts, cultural objects, or remains are taken from their native land due to colonization, theft, or war, repatriation efforts aim to return them to their rightful place. And repatriation can apply to individuals, such as refugees or expatriates, as well as cultural heritage items, such as ancient artifacts or sacred objects. There's too many big words. So this is similar to a slide that I used in my last presentation, and that is the term art and objects in cultural context. And as I pointed out then, one person's material culture and sacred objects are another people's art. And this part of this gets back to this concept of cultural patrimony, which is the historical and artistic materials that are created by peoples as an expression of themselves and in turn belonging to them. In the context that we're talking about today, the issue of cultural patrimony and repatriation looms very large. And there are key questions about who owns the cultural symbols of the past. And repatriation is usually connected to the idea that a group's modern cultural identity is tied to the objects of its ancient history. And we find there's a lot of discussion now about how things from the past are used currently to represent a people's history. And there's a lot of argument, particularly going on now in Europe, about whether a castle in what is now Romania is really Romanian or Hungarian. There's a lot of arguing going on about whether Lviv, which is a major city in western Ukraine, is Ukrainian or Polish. And so all of these things are ideas that are tied to a people's history. So if we talk about it in terms of objects, objects are usually considered to be some kind of a link, the tangible symbols of a link between the group's past and its present. And debate around this is oftentimes very thick with the idea of cultural identity, who you are, who your people are, what your history is, us versus them. This concept of group or cultural identity is often tied into or tied with objects. So where do museums come in? Well, museums, as we'll talk about and we talked about before, have a lot of stuff. And over the past few years, now turning to what's happening specifically with regard to Indigenous peoples in this country, over the past few years, claims have been made by Indigenous communities for the return of their stolen cultural heritage and skeletal remains have reached the general public. Again, this used to be an idea that was primarily of concern in a very small world of museum directors and their curatorial staff. But as Native groups and indigenous peoples became more aware, perhaps, of their need for self-expression and establishment in a larger sense of their past identity, these claims have become much more widely spread and have attracted much more attention. And to some degree, there's a lot of discussion, and I mentioned this when I talked about the Benin art and the Elgin marbles. These claims really reflect, in a large degree, the inherent violent nature of many museums' collections. A lot of these things were taken from peoples, actively taken, and particularly when we look back at the rather sad history of the way people in this country dealt with indigenous populations. And clearly we're not unique in that sense, but that doesn't make it any better. So the focus of the activities I'm going to talk about today really relate to what's called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. And this was a federal law passed in 1990 that recognizes the rights of federally recognized tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and lineal descendants of those groups in regard to human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. So this is a quote from the Department of Interior Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has provisions that require the federal government to enforce acts that treat remains of Native ancestors and their belongings with dignity, and to return them to their communities with respect for their customs, religion, and traditions. The Act requires agencies and institutions to repatriate or transfer Native American human remains and other cultural items to the appropriate parties by first consulting with lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations on Native American human remains and other cultural items. It requires protecting and planning for Native American human remains and other cultural items that may be removed from federal or tribal lands. A key concept here is this concept of tribal lands, because the tribal lands are not where the tribes are today, but those are the lands where they originally inhabited. And you'll see, particularly here in the Northwest, the real move to recognize the fact that most things are built on the lands of indigenous peoples. And you'll see a lot of signs places that says that this land belonged to whatever tribe it was that was represented here. So the Act requires agencies and institutions to repatriate or transfer Native American human remains and other cultural items to the appropriate parties by first identifying and reporting all Native American human remains and other cultural items in inventories and summaries of holdings or collections. Second of all, it requires giving notice prior to repatriating or transferring human remains and other cultural items. So that you have to both do this and you have to give notice of it being proposed to be done. So there was this update within the last year of the Act and points out that if human remains or ceremonial objects or funeral objects were taken from tribal lands or federal lands, they need to be returned. And these objects cannot be on display or used for research unless there's consultation and explicit permission from the tribe they belong to. And the burden, rather than being on the tribes to request items, the burden for repatriation is on the museums. And it's on the museums to reach out for their permit, or for the burden is on museums to reach out to tribes for permission to use any items in either research or an exhibit. So what are the categories of eligible materials under the Act? There are 4 categories. The first of these is human remains, and that's defined as the physical remains of a human body or any parts thereof. The second is funerary objects, that is objects that as part of the death rite or ceremony of a culture are reasonably believed to have been placed with the human remains either at the time of death or later, that is, items that accompany death of the body. Sacred objects, those are objects needed by traditional Native American religious leaders for the practice of Native American religions. And then fourthly, a very broad category. And this is what are called the objects of cultural patrimony. And these are defined as objects that have ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to the Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. It should also include Alaska Natives, but that's not specifically pointed out here. So since this is so key to museums, there's a need for a broad implementation of this and guidance. The guidance is, in terms of the position of the Association on American Indian Affairs, is that, quote, the new regulations are crystal clear. Institutions do not own much of their native collections, and therefore they must ask for consent from affiliated nations before they can do anything with those items. That's a pretty broad and strong statement.
Lowell?
Yeah.
Does that include representations of them, like a photograph or a drawing?
As far as I know, the question is whether it includes photographs or representations. As far as I know, it's the objects themselves, not photographs. So I think Edmund Curtis's photographs are probably safe as are drawings, but it refers to specific items, physical objects, or human remains. So there is a kind of an oversight group that has developed standards for museums with Native American collections. It's called SMNAC. And these standards include the following: provide actionable recommendations for Native inclusion, motivate museums toward collaboration and partnership with Native communities, emphasize the responsibility and accountability inherent in the stewardship of Native collections and teaching cultural content, recognize the colonial legacy of museums and provide opportunities to educate about this history and its ongoing impact on Native peoples. In addition, they need to address the need for cultural sensitivity and competency, provide support for Native American museum professionals, staff, board members, and volunteers, inform museums about the unique status of tribal governments and sovereignty, and develop methods for working with Native communities. That concept of sovereignty is really important, because most people don't realize that the recognized tribes are considered sovereign nations. They're physically located in this country, but they are administratively and organizationally separate. And so that's an idea that's of importance in terms of museums being needing to recognize this issue. So on a first look, In the late 1980s, the Smithsonian Institution found itself at the center of controversy regarding its possession of skeletal remains of indigenous peoples. The Smithsonian reportedly held 35,000 skeletal remains, with 18,500 of them being Native American remains. American Museum of Natural History's Human Osteology collection houses approximately 3,500 Native American skeletal remains. And as of now, and this was in the, probably 3 or 4 years ago, more than 110,000 remains of Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Alaskan Natives are still in museums, universities, and federal agencies.
Oh, here, could you talk about what some of these numbers mean? I mean, here's a leg going over here and a leg going over there. They may or may not belong to the same person.
Right, these are individual bones.
Okay.
There's got to be bad karma in this room. Maybe it has to do with what I'm talking about. there could be a very obvious explanation for this. I'm treading on sacred hallowed ground. So to give you an idea of what some of these things are like, this is the Physical Anthropology Lab at Harvard. This is E.A. Hooton, a very well-known physical anthropologist. My major professor trained with him. And very common in museum collections are large collections of skulls. And physical anthropologists in the past spent most of their time trying to figure out new indices, new ways of measuring skulls to provide, basically, to a large degree, classification. But you can see this is just a small proportion of the skulls in the lab there at Harvard. Typical, a lot of this activity coincided with the human eugenics movement in this country, and a lot of it had to do with racial classification. And so here you'll see an old museum display of skulls by race, and you can see the representation both of modern folks and skulls. Another example of this is this display. And here we have, all different kinds of people. But what I like really about this is these differences simply reflect the diversity and supremacy of God's creation. How about that? So I don't think this is an anthropology museum. It may be in Alabama, but clearly representing a creationist versus an evolutionary point of view, because most people would probably have believe that these differences came about through the process of adaptation and evolution. So where did these skeletal remains in museums come from? Well, a lot of them will be quite accidental discoveries. For example, I did an assessment of the skeletal material at the Milwaukee Public Museum looking for pathologies. It was one of my projects when I was working in the museum world. And the typical thing would say on the accession notes, found by a farmer plowing his fields in Menominee County. So that you find all the accidental things. Grave robbers. And having grown up in Central Washington, a typical activity was to go out and look for Indian graves. I didn't do this, of course. Go out and look for Indian graves and dig them up and find and see what you could find, and usually ignore the skeletal material and see if there are other kinds of grave goods. So that's really not that unusual in the not that distant past. Sometimes individuals will donate their body to a museum, particularly a medical museum, but even in more general, donated bodies that come either from individuals or from institutions. Say after skeletal material has been used by a medical school, they may go to a museum. Clearly, an important source of skeletal material is from archaeological digs, both amateur and professional. And amateur archaeology is a great activity for those who undertake it, and it's terrible for anybody that's got any interest in how archaeology should be conducted and the importance of items in situ. Anthropological expeditions, nothing unusual about going to the South Pacific Islands and coming back with a skull. There's just all kinds of material, particularly skulls, because they're much more fun and interesting than the long ones. And then construction sites. So this is an example. This is a burial mound in Kentucky. This is from the Mound people. And you can get an idea. This is the size of this. It's a very, very large mound. Here's another mound. This is excavation of a mound in Alabama. Here are some burials. Those are stone cists and graves with Native American remains in them. This is an excavation of Native American burial ground someplace in the south. You can see the large number of bodies that are displayed there. Road construction. It's a little hard to see, but here, there's a body, there's a burial right here. If you have a construction site and you find Native American remains or cultural materials, you have a big problem because you stop the construction. And the law requires that it be excavated by an anthropologist or an archaeologist. So you do not want to be building an apartment building over a Native American burial site. Just in case any of you guys are going to go out and be apartment developers, find out where you're digging before you dig, just like power lines. This is from the early 1900s. But this is a collection of Native American skeletons and cultural material in an American museum. And you can see casual skeletons hanging against the wall over there along with the other cultural items. And here's an example. The museum rediscovered a skeleton. So there's a skeleton in storage, and my gosh, we didn't know it was there, but here it is. Little cavalier. So I want to think for just a minute about the words we use. Skeletal remains versus human remains. Those words sound very similar and represent the same things, but it brings up the question of connotation versus denotation. That is, denotation is what something is. Connotation is the meaning of that. And to me, the term skeletal remains has a very different connotation than the term human remains. Because by talking about skeletal remains, you really potentially dehumanize. And it's important, and I think lots of times people lose sight of the fact that these materials represent people. And they needed to be treated with respect. And that's part of the issues that have come up, is this need for respect. So I'm going to go back now to talk about what's happening with regard to museums and the implementation of the regulations. This is a headline from Time. American Museum of Natural History closes certain displays amid new federal regulations. Here's the American Museum of Natural History. Probably a number of you have been there. It's one of the premier encyclopedic museums in the world. And here is a statement by the president of the American Museum of Natural History earlier this year. While the actions we are taking this week may seem sudden, they reflect a growing urgency among all museums to change their relationships to and representation of Indigenous cultures. The halls we are closing are vestiges of an era when museums such as ours did not respect the values, perspectives, and indeed shared humanity of Indigenous peoples. This is a really essential thing for us to do in order to also begin the process of repairing some of the harm and damage and building a new set of relationships that can help to move us all forward. That's a pretty powerful statement. And that's coming from one of the directors of one of the premier museums in the United States. So here's the Eastern Woodlands Hall at the American Museum of Natural History. And here's what it looks like now. It's closed. This is one of the two major halls they closed. They closed the Woodlands Hall and the Plains Hall. So basically, those areas of the museum are closed. In some cases, they simply took material out of cases, but the exhibits remained open, but specific items were removed. How about the Field Museum? The Field Museum, again, this is from the New York Times. Field Museum covers some native displays as new rules take effect. The Chicago institution's move is in response to updated federal regulations that require museums to consult with tribes before exhibiting Native American cultural items. Here's the Field Museum. Probably some of you have been there. It's a great museum. One of the most outstanding anthropological museums in the world. So I'm going to show the representations of 4 items. This is a Inuit bag. The session year was in 1897. Here's a description. This fur bag was collected at Port Clarence, Alaska by miner W. Bruce, who led a group of Alaskan natives on a tour around the country in the 1890s, about 3 decades after Alaska was purchased from Russia. Why it's on display, and this is the key thing for these next few slides. Why it's on display. The law covers cultural remains, covers human remains, burial belongings, sacred items, and objects of cultural patrimony, but does not cover everyday tools or accessories. Pueblo ceramic bowl, and this is the accession record. It's not the bowl, as you can tell. This is the accession record. It was obtained, that accession is what year it was obtained, 1894. The ceramic bowl was collected in Arizona, purchased from a British collector and trader named Thomas B. Cairn. Why it's off display. The museum said the bowl is consistent with ancient Puebloan funerary objects. It is possible the tribes would consider it as considered cultural patrimony, meaning it has an ongoing cultural importance to the native group. So this was determined as potentially being a significant ceremonial object, and therefore fell under the regulations. There's the third item, the Pawnee drum. This was obtained in 1902, drum made by a Pawnee man named George Beaver, collected by a field museum curator, used in the important ceremony called the Ghost Dance. So this is clearly an item of great cultural significance from the point of view of being a ceremonial object. It's on display. And it's on display because it's part of a Field Museum's exhibit, Native Truths, which opened in 2022. And this exhibit was created in consultation with representatives of over 100 tribes. Pawnee nations selected the drum for display, although they could have sought its return. So this is the example of how the Field Museum worked with the tribe, or group of tribes, to enable them to display the drum. And here's an interesting one. This is a Noxal, or a Belacula mask. And if any of you studied Native Americans, you'll realize that the tribes of the Northwest all have new names, going back to their indigenous names, as opposed to the names that were given to them. And it's been a long time since I studied linguistics, and so I may have a trouble stumbling over some. I'm having trouble stumbling other stuff as well. But this was obtained in 1897. It's a painted eagle mask. It's from the Noxalk Nation, which lies along the central coast of British Columbia. It sits in the Field Museum atop a display of vibrant, colorful masks, as described as representing the spirits of ancestors, creatures of the animal world, and mythical beings. Now here's the key thing. Why is it on display? The repatriation law applies only to tribes recognized by the U.S. government. And these tribes, the masks on display, come from Canada. The mask has sometimes taken down international objects at the request of tribes. So, if we're going to return things, first of all, we have to know what we've got. And second of all, you've got to have some idea of where it should go. And I just got a couple of slides here showing this is in the Museum of Man in San Diego, a very large anthropological museum. Representatives of tribes and museum curators or museum workers that are inventorying materials to determine what needs to be repatriated, and to whom it should go. Arkansas, similar process. Here you've got a tribal representative that's working with the museum to determine of all these objects, which ones fall under this regulation, which ones are objects of everyday use, which ones are ceremonial or funerary objects. So that's getting ready to send things back. Here we're sending things back. This is a welcoming thunder beings back home. This is the repatriation of human remains and their burial on tribal lands. Welcoming ancestors back home. Another group, these are probably, I'm not sure, probably Plains Indians of some tribe. You can see the spirit catcher up here. Soul catcher. So that's another example. This is the reburial of human remains in Colorado. So there's a lot of activity going on, beginning with repatriation of human remains, but then moving into the importance of repatriation of cultural materials. So I want to go down the street. I want to go to the Burke Museum. This slide shows their repatriation policy. It says the Burke Museum is committed to both the legal and ethical principles of NAGPRA, federal law that allows tribes to reclaim human remains and cultural items from museums and other institutions. The Burke Museum works with Native American tribes to identify and repatriate cultural items covered by NAGPRA, and NAGPRA combines administrative law, property law, and criminal law to protect the civil rights and freedoms of Native tribes. In the past, Native American remains were brought to museums with little or no regard to the condition or concerns of the affiliated communities. So here's a repatriation notice that came out recently from the Burke Museum. In accordance with our institutional repatriation policy, the Burke Museum hereby announces its intent to repatriate ancestral remains to the Texamaquock, Kanakabar Indian Band. The ancestral remains represent one individual from the Kewok Creek watershed, which is part of the ancestral and current territory of the Kewok. The ancestor was removed from a cave burial in the Kewok Creek watershed in 1926 by the prospector Sidney R. Dunham and received by the Burke Museum in 1944. The remains were then accessioned into the museum's permanent collection, accession number 3320. In 2002, 2004, 2005, the Burke Museum notified the Kanaka Bar Band, Sukmam Band, and the Lighten Band about the ancestor in the museum's care. The Kanaka Bar Indian Band has submitted a claim to repatriate those remains. These remains are descendants of the community who stewarded Kiowak, where the ancestor's burial was located. The Burke Museum honors the need for this ancestor to return to their community. The social organization of the Northwest Coast Indians was rather loose, and the basic organization in many cases were small bands. And so it was important for them to try to figure out which band, or give the bands a chance to represent themselves with regard to this individual and these remains. The thing that's interesting about this is if we go back and look at the Field Museum, they did not feel it was necessary to repatriate the mask from BC. These remains would not fall under the regulations from NAGPRA because they were not from a U.S. tribe. They're in fact from BC. So I think what you see here is a policy by the museum that goes past this letter of the law to the spirit of the law. That is, the spirit of the law is that these remains, whether they are of U.S. Native tribes or Indigenous peoples or Canadian Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, they need to be considered the same. And so the decision was made by the Burke to repatriate these remains. Now this is an incredibly complex issue, and my stumbling around this morning, again I apologize, has not made it any clearer, perhaps. But there is a website, if you're interested in following up on this. ProPublica has a site called the Repatriation Project, the Delayed Return of Native Remains. And basically there are a number of presentations or pieces of information here that reflect how much skeletal materials were found in what museums are taking active roles in repatriation and some of the issues. And it's an extremely in-depth look at the issues specific to the human remains or the skeletal remains, and not so much other cultural objects. But it's a good illustration of what the situation is. So with that, I'm going to close and I'll take some questions.
These federal regulations apply to the items held by private collectors.
Yeah, Don.
The 1990 law, or the law you're talking about, talks about recognized tribes.
Right.
The Chinook and the Duwamish almost got recognized in the year 2000. What did they do with things from those tribes? Those were the two tribes that had the most interaction with the Europeans.
That's a very complex legal issue. I will not try to get into the issues of tribal recognition. As far as I understand it, the law applies to recognized tribes. And that's a whole different can of worms, which I'm not in a position to address. Because the law is specific, and that's why the return of items or objects, human remains, to tribes in BC is not in the letter of the law, but it's in the spirit of the law.
Wouldn't that apply to?
I think it would apply to that. But I don't think the law, my understanding of the law would be that it does not apply to non-recognized tribes or other organizations. I'm using tribes in the broadest sense. Alaskan Natives aren't tribes. Hawaiian is a different organization as well. Yeah.
So, how do we know where the line is between Canada and the U.S.? It surely must be different.
There's a fence.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. How do we know where the line is between Canada and the U.S.? Well, if you've got a settlement on the west coast of Vancouver Island, that's not in the U.S. If you get into the Colville, the lines probably do not reflect the homeland of the tribes. The Balacula, as an example, where that mask came from, are clearly of British Columbia. I don't. Some of our tribes, I'm not sure how some of the Salish tribes. They probably overlap. But it's a good question. Let's Don.
Thank you. Well, two issues. I spent some time in Utah. There's an awful lot of amateur archaeology going on there. And then second issue, the study of skulls, I wonder if that hasn't been just overtaken by DNA analyses now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of having physical anthropology used to be basically defined as the measurement of old bones. Clearly, as a physical anthropologist, I've never measured a bone. So the answer is yes. But those were typological collections that were developed and basically mostly in the late 1800s, really up to the 1920s. Yeah. So that from that point of view, it's a whole different ballgame. But the bones still exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, Don.
Just a couple of comments. There is a vast trade going on in artifacts for private collectors. Follow up kind of on the very first collection, and that involves many dealers around the country, many collectors around the country. Many of these things are probably taken from graves, but they're being sold, and the prices are rising rapidly in this area. Another thing that relates to the museums, that in many cases the everyday items are cleared. You can go ahead and show those. But in many cases the tribes bury those items with the people who have died for them to take into supposedly a next life. So the museums are faced with a problem here of knowing exactly where they came from, because this takes an everyday item into a religious connotation, which makes it particularly difficult.
Thanks very much. Those are two really important points. I think one of the things is that a lot of goods came, as I mentioned, from grave robberies. So if you've got cultural goods that were buried with somebody, they fall into that definition. The other thing is, I think if you've got an exhibit, you may have a heterogeneous arrangement of pieces and parts. And if you've got a ceremonial pipe in there, that pipe is very different than a ditty bag or a pair of moccasins. Yeah, right.
We are all seated here today on what was Indian land.
Absolutely.
And that land was given by, I think it was Chief Seattle, in an agreement while we were yet a territory. And I wonder whether or not they would still have claim for us.
Claim for us as inhabitants of the tribal land? Well, I don't think we're members of the tribe. But that's a good point. And your point, that's why you see a lot of places now, particularly public institutions, have a sign that says this land, who it belonged to, and there's a very specific wording that I can't remember that relates to that idea of us realizing and respecting the fact that we are on tribal lands. Yeah, right.
Well, you can, today at least, go and contract with someone who's a Native American. Sorry. You can go and contract with someone who creates this art who's a Native American. If you can prove that this art was created in that fashion, in other words, you paid somebody to do it.
That's entirely different. If you've got an item that was let's take a common example. If you've ever been in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, you see trading posts. And the trading posts contain pottery that are made by Native American potters. They put it in there to sell. So the goods that are purchased are different than ceremonial goods. I'm not sure what you're...
Well, if you can prove that it was created in that fashion, presumably you get to keep it and.
That's the problem with the section. That's why if you go to a museum inventory, you'll see that, you know, information on how an item was obtained. The Field Example Museum had specific on a section of items. Well, I can tell you that that's not typical of accession records in a museum. They're usually not that detailed. Other questions? Yeah, Lester.
Oh, I am concerned about a conflict between science and what goes on with these museums. So my first question is, why do so many museums have so many skeletal remains? Are they still researching the material?
You want an answer to that? They have them because they have them. They got them in boxes and drawers, and they sit there. I would say that of your large museums, the percentage of material that's on exhibit, you virtually never see any exhibits of skeletal material, human remains anymore. You don't see that in museums. The percentage of material that's on exhibit is very small for most museums. And the percentage of material that is being used for research is very small. So to a large degree, what you see in museums is stuff being stored.
Yeah, so they don't really need them.
They don't need them.
Meaningful.
Right.
But I'm thinking of a very recent, relatively recent case, and I'm surprised you didn't bring it up.
I'm not going to.
And that's, of course, the Kennewick Man case that occurred at the Burke Museum. Now, that was very controversial for those of you who may not recall. This was a skeletal remains found somewhere in eastern Washington by some kids, I think, just in a riverbank or something like that. And Burke got a hold of this and started doing research on it, which was interesting because you wanted to know where did that individual come from. This was what, about 11,000 years old? Was that it?
Pretty close. About 9 to 11, like 9,000.
And it was a huge controversy. Burke was doing research on this, and the natives who couldn't prove that they had any relationship to this individual other than that the remains were found on what had been their turf. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. I actually thought about that, and the Kennewick Man story is a whole other lecture, a whole other talk. Let me give you a little bit of background. The remains were found by the Columbia River. Kennewick is one of the Tri-Cities in central Washington. The remains were found there. They were taken to the Battelle Labs, where I used to work, examined by an anthropologist there. Then they went to the museum. It's a long history. They were for a while at the Smithsonian. Then they came to the Burke, and I think the last I knew, they were still at the Burke, but they are basically locked away. Part of the problem was competing demands from Indian tribes in central Washington as to whose remains they were. There was opposition to the scientific study of the remains, and so was and I think still continues to be a major political issue between the tribes themselves, and that's, as I say, that's a whole talk in and of itself, which I'm not sure I've got the guts to give after today. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Al?
Maybe you could give us an update. I saw something recently that they found human footprints dated 23,000 years ago, which predates all of our assumptions about the peopling of the Americas. Do you have anything current on that?
The answer is no, but the dates of the peopling of the New World are widely debated. There's a lot of dates that put people at the end of down in Tierra del Fuego 20,000 years ago. Well, if they got there 20,000 years ago, they must have gotten here quite a bit earlier than that, unless they ran all the way down the Andean mountains. Even when I was an anthropologist, I didn't have much knowledge of what was happening in the New World. I kind of was interested in temples, tombs, and hieroglyphs as opposed to what was happening in my backyard. So even when I was informed, I wasn't informed, but I did take North American archaeology. And the ideas or arguments, the person I took North American archaeology from dated the entry of man into the New World at 35,000 BC. He was on the lunatic fringe, but when I got my PhD, I have to tell the story, now that I brought that term up. When I got my PhD, I was on the faculty at the University of Washington for 1 year, and we had a new chairman. So he invited me in as a new faculty member. He says, well, Lowell, on the basis of your research, where does it fit? Is it in the avant-garde of the lunatic fringe? And so that term has stuck with me for 50 years. Anything else? Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you all.